Hello and welcome to Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics, the podcast where we revisit beloved animated films to decide which ones are truly worthy of being called a classic and making our list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics. My name is Ben and joining me as always is my good friend Liam. Liam, we've done all the Disney films, what are we looking at now?
Well, Ben, we had a lot of great suggestions, people wanting us to look at DreamWorks films, the Pixar films, new kids on the block like Illumination. I say new kids on the block. Illumination have been making films for ages now, but it just feels like they're very new. I'm old, Ben. I'm old.
They've not been around for 85 years like Disney.
No one has, it turns out. Because we started looking at, okay, well, what are all the major animation studios? And let's go right the way back. So we're actually starting with, and as you can tell by the title of this episode, the first film produced by Don Bluth and his spin-off studio, Don Bluth Studios. And we're looking at The Secret of Nim. And you may remember Don Bluth and several animators who were sort of the young guard at Disney during the 70s and were sort of going to be the next generation, were sort of clashing with the old guard. And I think the final kind of straw that broke the camel's back in their regard was The Fox and the Hound and the direction Disney took in that film. And as you may remember from our discussion of that film, I very much agreed with Don Bluth and his colleagues. So I'm very excited to be visiting the films that they produced after leaving Disney, because if this is the sort of the ethos they wanted to take, I want to see the type of films they're going to make on their own.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. So as you mentioned, we talked a lot about Don Bluth and his work with Disney on the Fox and the Hound podcast and also the Rescuers podcast. So if you're not familiar with Don Bluth's time with Disney, do go and listen to those episodes. And because we left that little string dangling at the end of those podcasts, we thought it'd be a good place to start. So we're jumping back to 1982, and we're looking at, as you say, The Secret of Nim. Now, full disclosure, Liam, I'd never seen this film before. Do you have any history with this film?
I have seen most of the Don Bluth films, and as a child, I absolutely loved them. I have not seen many of them since I was a child, so I'm very excited to be revisiting these, and The Secret of Nim was one of my favourites.
Well then, we've got both the tint of nostalgia and someone coming brand new to this film, which I think is a perfect way to start, so let's dive into The Secret of Nim. And my very first note is, before we get any characters or animation, and that the United Artists logo from the 80s has a real Terminator vibe to it.
Yeah, my first note on this film is that the opening titles are very, very 80s. Or I suppose not titles, but the company logos.
Lots of synth.
Yeah. Synth and then intercut with the classic MGM lion.
So we open with some narration from a character we don't actually properly meet until much later on, but we do cut back to him occasionally, and that is the character of Nicodemus, voiced by Shakespearean actor Derek Jacobi, and he's doing some magical writing. Now, Liam, I want your opinion on this, because he's got this sort of quill where he dips it in magic ink and then he writes, and a couple of seconds later, the writing appears, right? Is this just a thing of they couldn't be asked to correlate his hand movements with the writing? Because they don't match up at all. So they're like, oh, we'll just have a delay on it. Or do you think it was a deliberate decision of he just sort of vaguely waves his hand and then his intention goes onto the paper?
Well, the weird thing is, in the original source material for this film, Nicodemus is not magical. In fact, there is no magical element to the source material, and Don Bluth was like, I want to introduce magic because it's what makes fantasy, and, it really captures your imagination. But you've convinced me that the reason he introduced magic was so that he didn't have to match up hand animations.
It makes sense, because otherwise, if that's not the case, ink that is on a 5-second delay has no functional benefit over regular ink, right?
It's very weird. It's an immediate stylistic choice where you're just like, okay, this is the tone of this film. As it turns out, it's not really the tone of this film, it's just a weird magic bit at the start. Most of the film is, mice in a field.
Yeah, we'll come to that shortly. The other thing that really jumps out to me straight away is this colour palette. Now, I think some of that is the time when this was being made, and I think there was a tendency to use these kinds of colour palettes, and also some of it I think is a just a Don Bluth preference. He likes these sort of dark, murky browns and greens and blues and greys. It's a darker tone in a very literal sense. But also, reading about the production of this, Don Bluth was clear that he wanted to revisit older animation techniques that were more labour-intensive, but he felt they produced more depth to them. And you can definitely see the fruits of those labours, because this film, there is some very gorgeous animation. And all these backgrounds in particular, they are gorgeous images to look at in and of themselves.
I can quite happily say I think this film is beautiful, particularly if you compare it to what was being made in Disney at the same time. Like, the 80s in Disney was one of the ugliest periods, and this film, like, these are the animators that Disney could have had. And this is clearly directed by someone who is in love with the art form of animation, and I think that's very, very clear right from the off in this film. And so after this introductory sequence with just a very dramatic and 80s title sequence, we join our protagonist of the story, which is Mrs. Brisby, bizarrely renamed from Mrs. Frisbee in the source material. I guess they were just like, nope, that's just a silly name, we'll go with Brisby instead.
Well, I was actually reading up on this, because I thought, oh, they've gone, we can't call our character Mrs. Frisbee, that's a silly name. They had recorded the dialogue as Frisbee. They spoke to the company that owns Frisbee, the brand name is in the novelty flying disc, and they said, we're not going to let you use it. So they had to go back and re-record all the lines as Brisby. Except for the role of the Great Owl, voiced by John Carradine, who they couldn't get back, so they just had to edit the B's. So I wish it was your version, Liam, but it's something far more stupid.
I mean, first of all, I find it very, very reassuring to be immediately greeted with very Bluthian anthropomorphic animals. It's a really clear art style that I just find very reassuring.
How would you compare it to, say, how Disney anthropomorphizes mice, for example? There's a lot of Disney mice knocking around.
It's weird. It's not that there's... I suppose it is a distinct style, but what I find is that so many of the characters look the same. So over these films, we're going to see particular characters pop up over and over again, but they'll be a completely different animal. I mean, one thing that I think is very clear in this one, for example, is if you look at the youngest mouse is clearly drawn by the same animator who did the young rabbit in Robin Hood. In fact, the sister sibling of these mice was clearly drawn by the same animator who did the older rabbit in Robin Hood. Like, these characters, you recognise them. It's not rotoscoping, it's the same artist. And that will pop up a lot, particularly with the characters that tend to be voiced by Dom DeLuise. Not the case in this film. I think Jeremy is probably the most unique and distinct Dom DeLuise character, but after that, they all pretty much just look identical. I will say, I'm not saying that as a bad thing. I really like that there is this, you recognise animators as a result.
I think some of that probably is a distinct choice as well, because clearly these animators felt like Disney was basically just pressing everyone into being a production line, a machine. Now, obviously, that's true of every film studio to a degree, particularly huge corporate ones, and particularly in animation as well, where there is just a lot of grind and a lot of work to do. But it's really nice to see those individual voices and styles being at the forefront.
So we join Mrs. Brisby, who is going on a journey through a very sort of treacherous-looking field to meet with a friend of her late husband, Mr. Ages, who diagnoses her son with pneumonia and gives him medicine. And immediately I'm just like, this is a Don Bluth film. We're right in with, serious illness and this child on the verge of death. It's strange that when you add those elements, even though we're dealing with anthropomorphic mice, the world becomes a lot more grounded in our reality. I can't imagine Sebastian diagnosing Ariel with pneumonia.
There's a parallel universe where Don Bluth and pals don't leave Disney, and they end up being the ones making The Little Mermaid instead. Mr. Aegis, I don't know if you agree with this, Liam. I feel he's just that grumpy badger from The Fox and the Hound in terms of
yes.
design and voice.
I believe the voice actor is the same voice actor who did... Because I recognise it, and I think it's the same voice actor who voices the King of the Fairies in The Black Cauldron, which is why when he started speaking, I was like, I don't like this character.
One thing I do like is he's got above his door a sign that says, "Welcome, go away." I can get on board with that.
I know you've mentioned the background, but compare this to, just a couple of decades ago and me moaning about the backgrounds in 101 Dalmatians, which a lot of people have got in touch and said that, like, it's a stylistic choice and they actually really like that. Whereas I just couldn't get on board with it. Whereas the backgrounds of this are so detailed and so beautiful.
I also feel they've got depth and geography and space as well. Like, one thing we said about, for example, Robin Hood was it feels like everyone exists on a 2D plane. That never feels the case here. Like, it feels like this is a 3D space with an up and a down and a foreground and a background, and yeah, I think it's something they do really, really well. And again, it's hard to do with 2D animation. It's easy to forget that it's very hard to create that sense of depth when you've got static canvases and then you're moving cells around on top of them, but they do it really well in this.
And so, with her medicine in hand, Mrs. Brisby heads off across the treacherous field, bumping into our Dom DeLuise character, Jeremy, who is a clumsy crow, and I'm going to be entirely honest, I think the film doesn't need Jeremy at all.
My note, Liam, just says, yes, Dom DeLuise.
Here's the thing is, there are some Bluth films which really benefit from that character. I think An American Tail, which we'll be moving on to shortly. The Dom DeLuise character in that works very well. I mean, he's the main character in A Troll in Central Park, but whether that works or not, we'll get to that. But here he doesn't really add anything, and there's this extended sequence of Mrs. Brisby talking to Jeremy, and then they have to escape the cat spawned from hell. And I just kept thinking, I really like this film. When's it going to get to the film that I like?
I haven't timed this, but I would genuinely not be surprised if Jeremy, this crow, whose main thing is that he's clumsy and can't take a hint when he's hitting on people.
Oh, yeah. I forgot that was his character trait.
I genuinely think he gets more time than the secondary hero, the villain, and Nicodemus combined on screen.
I can believe that.
Which is insane, because he doesn't do anything.
Doesn't add anything to the story. He very much feels like a hangover from the source material, and one that they probably should have just cut or merged into a different character.
Conversely, though, we've not really talked about Mrs. Brisby. We've talked a little bit about the character design, but can I just say, I find this to be one of the most sincere and endearing voice performances I can think of in animation. I think the casting of Elizabeth Hartman, it just works. Like, there's such a humanity and sadness to her voice, and like when she's dealing with Jeremy and he's kind of doing these big wacky comic performances, she's just got this voice that just kind of cuts through it and has this real honesty of like, I'm not going to be unpleasant towards this person, but I've got a child with pneumonia who's dying and my house is about to be destroyed by a giant plough. That's quite a hard thing to sell, and she does it really well.
The reason I'm laughing is I can't think of that situation ever coming about in a Disney film. That's such a perfectly Don Bluth I mean, even the decision to be like, hey, the protagonist of our film is a mother, and it's going to be about her trying to help her children. That's quite a grown-up subject matter to deal with in what is very much a film aimed and targeted towards children. I feel that Disney would just reject that outright and be like, no, we need younger protagonists.
Most Disney films have a character who wants to go on an adventure. That's why, we have I Want songs, right? We have characters who want to be somewhere different. Mrs. Brisby's the opposite to that. She's someone who, what she wants is just to be safe and with her family. And we keep getting references to her husband, who we know almost immediately has died, and she's left alone with these 4 children. Again, it's a single widower trying to just make ends meet and get by in the world. Now, the fact she's a mouse makes it more accessible for kids, and obviously this is a children's film, but yeah, it is quite a bold choice. And as you say, I think some of it is what they wanted to do in terms of the stories they wanted to tell, and I think some of it is very much, not so much an anti-Disney statement, but a statement of purpose that we are distinct from this.
Another thing I do really like about this sequence is, watching this earlier, I was caught off guard when I realised just how much I missed gnarled and scary looking worlds in animation. It seems to be a very sort of like 80s thing that people talk about of like, kids films weren't afraid to terrify kids. But you don't have to terrify kids to have these quite upsetting settings, and they really sort of captured the world from a mouse's perspective, particularly in this chase sequence with Dragon.
Dragon's a cat, by the way, just to be clear. Yeah, I'd agree, and I think for the most part, there's some deviation later on in the film, which annoys me a bit, but certainly for the first half or so of this film, almost every shot is at mouse height, which I think is such a good shout because it makes the whole world seem huge and terrifying. So as we say, on heading back to her family, Mrs. Brisby bumps into the crow Jeremy, who's been tangled up in some string, and she kind of helps him escape the cat Dragon, and they sort of bumble off after a while. Can I just say, if we ever get around to doing a top 10 things I find very satisfying in the way they've been animated, this string would definitely be it, because it knots and moves in a very realistic way. And this is the moment where I went, these animators are very competent and they could have done the writing, they just didn't want to. Because this string moves like string.
Throughout this film, I kept noticing how bouncy the animation was and how fluid it was as well, which I feel I hadn't noticed in Disney as much other than in The Rescuers, where those characters have that bounce to them and it really does just bring them to life. And this string it's a set piece that they designed to show off their animation skills, and it's just absolutely beautiful. And so after returning home and we meet the various children and they all go to bed, we get a very forgettable song.
Is there a song? I'd forgotten about this. Sincerely, I didn't have any notes about any songs. Wow, okay.
Mrs. Brisby sings a lullaby to Timothy, the mouse dying of pneumonia, because remember, that's what this film is about.
Oh yeah. Liam, Mrs. Brisby has 4 children. How do you feel about these child voice actors? Because I know how much you love a child voice actor.
Luckily, they're not in it much, but no one particularly stands out as being competent.
During this sequence, Liam, when Mrs. Brisby gets home and we kind of meet her children and Auntie Shrew, and we just kind of get an idea of it's meant to be what's at stake. I made a note, and I really struggled to express this, and maybe if you've not seen this film, maybe just watch one of these sort of dialogue-heavy sequences where there's not really much action. But the performances, for the most part, I think are good, right? Maybe the kids are kids, whatever. But as I say, I think Elizabeth Hartman as Mrs. Brisby is great, and a lot of the other performances are strong too. And the animation, we've said, is beautiful. But they just don't seem to gel. It feels like the voice direction just hasn't quite synced up with the animation. It feels like the animation's a bit too fast for the voice performances. They just feel a bit uneasy. Do you get what I'm saying? Does that make any sense?
No, I think I had a similar issue on my viewing. I was concerned it might be a problem with the format we were watching it on, but no, I think now you say it, I can see that something just isn't quite matching up. It's not a sync issue in terms of, the audio is delayed. It's a direction issue, and it can take you out of it sometimes. They are just children, but the performance doesn't feel... And, anthropomorphic animals, I'm not expecting someone to sound like a mouse, but you compare this to something like James Earl Jones, and I'm like, I believe that's a lion talking right now.
Maybe it's just the pace of it as well, as you say. There's just not enough time between lines. One character finishes talking, the next immediately starts talking, which just isn't what you normally get in films.
And again, it comes to this bounce and fluidity that I think that Don Bluth as a director doesn't like things to be still for very long. It's got to always be moving because that's what brings animation to life. And when you apply that same direction to line delivery, you're just sort of giving yourself a problem.
I'd love to see him try anime. Maybe he does. Maybe that's what Titan A is.
Well, we'll see in about another 40 weeks. So, the next morning, Mrs. Brisby discovers that the farmer whose fields they live in has decided to start ploughing early. That means that she was hoping to stay put for 3 weeks whilst Timothy recovered, but she's going to have to move sooner than she wanted to. I do wonder why she doesn't just live in the safer part during all the time. Why does she have these 2 houses and every year one of them gets destroyed by ploughing?
I was wondering this. Now, maybe to join the dots, the idea is that, farmers rotate which fields they use, so you want to be in the field where stuff's growing, so you've got access to food and shelter, but then you have to move before it gets ploughed. But the solution feels like just don't live in the place that's periodically destroyed. Also, now I'm just saying it, her house is a block of concrete. How is a plough going to destroy that?
I assume the issue would be that when he goes to plough the field, he'll be like, oh, better move this block of concrete. Oh, look, there's mouse furniture in this.
And then he has an existential crisis. Actually, I say that. The implication is that Nim is aware that the rats have become self-aware later on, which is weird.
Yeah, because actually it's just after this sequence that we have a shot of the farmer's wife talking to the farmer saying, oh, that was just Nim on the phone, and they were asking if we noticed anything weird about the rats. And I was like, okay, well, they're seeding it quite early, but yeah, it does sort of bring up some existential questions there.
Also, I don't know what hours the office of Nim keeps, but like every time they've called the farmer, it's clearly the middle of the night.
But amongst all this, the way that Mrs. Brisby discovers this, I kind of just skimmed over, but it's one of the best sequences in the film, where the tractor just starts and the world starts shaking from their perspective, and we just get this fantastic action set piece of Mrs. Brisby trying to disable the tractor before it just demolishes her home.
What I like about this is, in another version of this script, Mrs. Brisby would do that, but she's not a swashbuckling adventurer, she's just someone who's just trying to look after their kids. And so she very quickly just gets tangled up in the machine. Although, weirdly, Auntie Shrew, who up to this point has been a sort of...
Shrew.
Well, a shrew. Not a sort of shrew, she is a shrew. But she's this sort of like bumbling, nasty comedy character. And then she whips into shape and like tears a tractor apart single-handedly. And I was like, why is this character suddenly a badass?
There's a fantastic bit of animation here where I think they've clearly rotoscoped over a real tractor, and it looks so imposing and terrifying during this sequence. And so having just seen this, they've managed to stop the destruction, but really they've only bought themselves a day. Auntie Shrew is like, you need to go and see the Great Owl. That's the only thing that will have the solution to your problem. And so Mrs. Brisby gets a ride from Jeremy, and they go deep into this gnarled, terrifying wood to see the Great Owl in one of the really most Bluthian sequences of animation.
I really don't know how I feel about this. There's some stuff I think is really interesting. You compare the Great Owl to Mama Owl from The Fox and the Hound. From a narrative perspective, they are not a million miles away. They're sort of these... I mean, owl characters often are meant to be sort of wise, but Mama Owl's very sort of maternal and involved and sort of lovable to these characters. The Great Owl is terrifying and... Well, just terrifying, actually. That's the sort of main characteristic. He lives in this horrible place full of spiders and bones.
Covered in cobwebs, which, like, kudos to the spider that was like, yeah, I'm going to build my cobweb on that thing.
It's brave to live so close to something that will clearly eat you almost immediately.
Oh, can I just say as well, the animation on that spider is terrifying.
As someone who really, really doesn't like spiders, I was like, I'm not enjoying watching this. But that's maybe a good sign.
Did you enjoy watching it get absolutely devoured by the Great Owl?
I don't really enjoy anything about spiders. I don't wish them ill, Liam. I just wish them to not be anywhere near me.
So, we mentioned existential crises, and I'm just sort of wondering where the Great Owl fits on this, because I'm like, clearly this owl has magical powers, right? I mean, for one, he's got a magical glow in his eyes, which, great bit of animation. I love when animators use backlighting as part of their animation. So,
I said I liked some stuff about the Great Owl. What I don't like is... I don't think it serves any narrative purpose, because what we get is Mrs. Brisby is desperate for a solution to avoid moving her home so Timmy can recover while he's having his medicine, right?
I know it's a cliche, but I've only just realised that the sick little child is called Timmy.
Oh, it's ridiculous. Mrs. Frisbee and Timmy. So she's desperate, so she speaks to Auntie Shrew. Auntie Shrew says there's only one animal that can help you, and that's the Great Owl. So we go on the journey to see the Great Owl, and he says, there's only one animal that can help you. It's Nicodemus. Go back to like 10 feet away from your house. Even at the time, I was like, if the Great Owl is never mentioned or seen again, this sequence is pointless. And having finished the film, we never see anything else of the Great Owl, so this sequence is entirely pointless.
So this is as good a place to mention this as any, but I really feel this film suffers from sort of the same problem that Sword and Stone did, in that it's clearly an adaptation of a book. And the narrative structure of a book is very different to the narrative structure of a film. Particularly a family animated film, which is going to be 80 minutes. There's a lot you have to get across in 80 minutes and trying to translate as many different parts of the book as you can, where the book sort of is like, you can have a chapter which is just like, this chapter is about going to see the great owl. This chapter is about going to see the rats. Whereas in a film narrative, if you follow that 3-act structure, Act 1 should be about introducing a problem and finding the solution to that problem, not stuff just kind of happening.
Yeah, and it's important to note, we're about halfway through the film at this point. We've brushed over a lot of the Jeremy stuff, but it is just some bumbling and, them sort of helping each other out, and there's not really much of a relationship there. As I say, he is hitting on her even though she's a mouse. She's just like, no thank you, I've got to get home to my sick family. It's a weird midpoint because when I was looking at the clock, I was like, I had a vague recollection of like, oh, there's like some horrible experiments done on these rats and they've got weird powers and they've got their own political structure. I was thinking, how the hell is this going to be fitted into 40 minutes? And we'll get to how the hell that's tackled fairly soon.
But yeah, really, the rats of Nim should have been introduced at the start of the second act, not 10 minutes after the midpoint. Mrs. Brisby now heads back to the farm, goes into the rosebush to meet Nicodemus and the rats of Nim, is confronted by the world's most aggressive yet ineffective guard.
Yeah, this is weird.
It's a great action set piece.
It doesn't make any sense though, does it?
No. Hi, I'm here to see Nicodemus. Just silently starts attacking her.
And then, as far as I remember, we never see that character again.
No, there's a throwaway line about like, oh, that's just, Jacob, the guard. He's like that.
He's like that, with murderous intent. He's got, like, electric claws or an electric weapon that he's, like, swiping at with her.
Yep. And he just does all of this silently, and it's terrifying. And she still gets past him, so great job, guard.
There's also a bit here where they have to sneak past Dragon, the cat, and we hear the farmer's wife say, I've never seen a cat sleep so much. And I was like, you've obviously never known literally any cat.
To be fair, they have been drugging the cat, haven't they?
Oh, yeah.
So I think maybe it's the cat is just asleep, 24 hours a day instead of the usual 20.
Yeah, maybe the cat's not even a bad guy. It's like, you keep drugging me, I hate this, I'm going to try and stop you. Oh, the cat's coming after us again.
We're going to have to drug it.
We're going to have to drug it. For rats that were experimented on in the laboratory with medicine against their will, they've got a weird lack of morality.
Because yes, it's at this point about, as you say, it's like 40 to 50 minutes in the film. We finally meet the rats of Nim. First of all, through the character of Justin, who is the kind of captain of the guard, and is like, oh, you're Jonathan Brisby's wife. You're very important to us. Come with me. And we just get introduced to this very intriguing and elaborate mouse society. They're clearly using electricity from the humans, and they're developing their own technology, but they're not self-sufficient is kind of what ends up being their main sort of motivation. And it's at this point where I'm just like, this is what I remembered and loved about Nim. And I was thinking, wow, this all should have came much, much earlier, because I understand they wanted this to be a story about Mrs. Brisby and her children, but you can still have that and get to the interesting, fantastical world sooner. First of all, maybe cut Jeremy.
I don't even intrinsically have a problem with Jeremy. I mean, I don't find him funny or likeable, which is a problem for a comedy side character, I suppose. But he just gets way too much waiting. But yeah, there's so much potential here, and it's not an exaggeration to say we get a few minutes of this sort of stuff. We spend longer than that with the rats, but we don't really get much of an explanation of what this society is. One thing that just doesn't really make much sense to me is, so shortly after this we get the tale of kind of what happened with them and why Jonathan Brisby, Mrs. Brisby's husband, was so important to them, where they were experimented on in the National Institute of Mental Health, which is what NIM is, and they were injected with some drug that basically made them become intelligent to a human level, or certainly similar level anyway. They were no longer just random rats and mice in cages, but they were sort of conscious being. I mean, rats and mice are conscious, but you know what I'm saying. They became sort of human level intellect. And then Jonathan Brisby helped them escape and sort of sacrificed himself in the process, and that's how they got away and set up their own society, which is a really interesting idea. But the problem is, like, all the other animals in this are sort of similar level of intellect. Like, there's even a bit where they talk about reading, and Mrs. Brisby says, oh, well, I can't read very well, but the children can. And I was like, well, hang on, isn't the point that none of these animals can read and only the rats can because they've had the drugs? Like, I don't get what the rules of this universe are.
Yeah, it's not particularly clear, and I don't mind that the film didn't get bogged down in explaining its world, but it could have done with an extra line here or there because, yeah, just to sort of like correct one thing, they do escape and live happily, and then Jonathan works with the rats of Nim over time, and it's during one of those, like, he will consistently go to them and then come back to his family and then go to them, and it's on one of those trips that he gets killed, which they don't draw too much attention to. Otherwise, the implication would be that he had his family before going to Nim, which he had his family after coming back to Nim. And I guess the implication is that Jonathan started experimenting on other rats and mice. I can understand his children being, more intelligent, but as for why his wife an anti-shrew is,
I really don't know, and it's a shame because I think there's something really interesting about doing a film where we get this, oh, they're anthropomorphic mice and they have rats and birds and they have their own little world, and then we say, by the way, this isn't like their version of the world. This is what the world is. They are actually talking. They are actually using written language. They are as clever as humans. We're not seeing a world where they're talking in mouse to each other. They're talking human language to each other. Like, that is a really interesting idea. And they sort of introduce it and then don't really explain how it works. And then they sort of go, don't worry about it, because here's a rat that is very clearly the villain.
Yeah, it's weird. I love the premise, as you say, but it only works if all of the rats were experimented on, and all of the animals we see have to come from the same place. And you can almost do kind of a reveal later in the film where they encounter mice or rats that weren't experimented on, because I think that sequence, the flashback to in the National Institute of Mental Health, where it shows them as how we see rats and mice, is quite disturbing. It's the Gus Gus thing in Cinderella, where we've established that mice wear clothes, and then to see a naked mouse is really weird and disturbing. And to have these anthropomorphic ones and then be like, no, this isn't normal for the world, this is unique to this society, is a really cool idea. But yeah, it falls apart because of the existence of Mrs. Brisby, Auntie Shrew, and Jeremy, I guess.
And presumably the other animals of this world. It's very clear that there's a lot of animals that weren't in Nim that basically seem to exist at more or less the same level of intellect as the rat.
Do you know what you could have done? Had the villain be poisoning, the water supply or something, and it's slowly turning all the animals nearby into, intelligent animals, and it's like, we're going to lead an uprising against people for revenge.
Or have the villain turning animals feral and using that to sort of generate fear. Oh no, wait, that's Zootropolis, isn't it?
Or, God forbid, having the villain do anything.
Let's talk about the villain then. I believe, and I may be misremembering, they appear in 3 scenes. The first scene we go, this guy's evil. The second scene we go, this guy's got a plan. The third scene, he executes his plan and then dies.
Well, there's actually a 4th scene, which is we first see Nicodemus looking in his mirror at this evil mouse and going, oh, that mouse is evil. So then when we actually meet them, it's like, oh, that's the evil mouse. Yep, they're evil.
Oh, and they're using the same bit of animation they used when Nicodemus was looking in his magic mirror. I guess that evil mouse just always moved in a very consistent way.
Do you know what's interesting is in the source material, all they are is kind of a traitor who doesn't agree with the plan and takes some of the mice and leaves. Some of the rats, rather, and leaves.
I was astonished when I read that this villain is more fleshed out in the film.
Yeah.
Shan Yu does more. And he's not meant to do anything. Also, I know I've talked about this already, but when Mrs. Brisby arrives, both Justin and the evil rat, and most of the other rats, are hitting on her. Just to be clear, why does... She is a different species to both Jeremy and the rats. Why do all species want to bang this specific mouse?
No, because as we've established, in animation, rats are boys and mice are girls. Hence Disney's famous mascot, Mickey Rat. The point is there's so much potential in the second half of this film that could have been fleshed out if it wasn't crammed into the second half of the film.
And speaking of things that don't get enough time to breathe, Mrs. Brisby finally meets Nicodemus, who we've had, as I say, a sort of couple of... It's not really a narration, because he's not talking to us as an audience. He's just talking to himself about sort of, guiding Mrs. Brisby and stuff. And we finally meet him, and he's this big, old, magic rat with glowing eyes. And he says, "Let me show you my various magic plot devices." He's got a book that talks about Jonathan Brisby. He's got a magic mirror. He's got an amulet, which just... as far as I can tell, it's just to go, here's a Deus Ex Machina. Hold on to that until later. It comes out of nowhere.
I understand the amulet, but it needed to be executed better.
Imagine if the Enchanted Rose in Beauty and the Beast was introduced 15 minutes from the end of the film. That's how incongruous it feels, just to go, and here's a magic thing, it's important.
Well, no, if it was introduced 15 minutes before the end of the film, no one really talked about it, and then at the end of the film, it kind of exploded and turned the Beast into a human, and no one was like, I guess? I will say, Nicodemus is amongst my favourite character designs in animation.
The design is superb. I think the choice of Derek Jacobi is really good. In my head, it was John Hurt. I don't know why.
It's because John Hurt is always those characters in animation.
He does have a great gravity to him and this sort of weight. And this is what I don't mind, is like, I feel like it's a real shame we didn't explore some of the sort of sciencey side of the rats. But the magic side, like, I can totally accept. Like, I kind of took the piss a little bit about his room of magical plot devices, but I don't need an explanation of why Nicodemus is magic. I just accept he's this magic old rat that leads all the other rats.
I do think the character of Nicodemus would have more of an impact if we hadn't already met the Great Owl, who is clearly this kind of otherworldly, godlike figure. And so to go from that, and then we meet Nicodemus, who's just kind of a lesser version of that, you should just cut the Great Owl. Great Owl serves no narrative purpose and kind of detracts from how cool Nicodemus is.
Now, do you think that we see too much of Nicodemus prior to this point? Because I don't mind, like, him talking and seeing maybe his hand and stuff move and, the writing, but we do basically just see him. It's this thing coming back to Beauty and the Beast again, funnily enough, where you were saying that you think the first time we see the Beast should be when he steps into the light. Do you think we see too much of Nicodemus?
Yes, we do. I think the hands and writing in the book should be all we see of Nicodemus. We don't even need the scene where he's looking in his magic mirror and goes, "Oh look, the evil mouse." Rat. I'm going to get that wrong so many times. So basically, after telling Mrs. Brisby the history of the rats of Nim and her husband, he says, "Look, we're scavengers. We shouldn't be scavengers. We're intelligent now and it feels wrong. We are supposed to be moving ourselves. But before we do, we will help you move. And so you go back to your house, you get your children ready, and we'll do the rest." Basically. And that's setting up like the finale of the film is going to be, right, the rats of Nim are going to help move this cinder block from one part of the farm to another part of the farm.
Now, Liam, it feels like I'm deliberately trying to find plot holes here, but even when I was watching this, I was like, hang on. Little baby Timmy can't be moved because he's got pneumonia. How is picking up the whole house with a bunch of ungainly pulleys and levers and bits of rope and swinging it around all over the place, how is that any better than carefully picking him up and carrying him somewhere?
Well, you see, Mr. Aegis said that he had to stay in bed.
Get the rats to move the bed then!
I do believe this is a problem in the source material, so I won't hold this against the film, but I mean, I've already held it against the film that they didn't correct issues in the source material anyway, so it's a bad story. In fact, though, before our finale of moving the house, one more thing needs to be done, which is that someone needs to drug the cat, because, it's the daily drugging of the cat. And Mrs. Brisby is like, I want to do this. Which, I guess. I still feel her character would have been like, no, I want to make sure my children are safe. I don't want to risk my life drugging a cat. I want to be with my children. But, narratively, they're like, oh, she has to do something heroic. So breaks into the farmhouse to drug the cat.
So they set it up that the rats are too big to get through the hole into the kitchen, right? Now, let's ignore the fact that the rats are intelligent and, can engineer enough to move a breeze block, right? They can't make the hole any bigger for whatever reason, fine. Wouldn't it make more sense if
they send one of the children? Yes. Particularly the Will Wheaton child.
We'll get to the Will Wheaton child, I promise. What I was going to say was, one of the rats, maybe Justin, says, look, the grown-up rats are too big, we'll have to send a child. And Mrs. Brisby looks like and says, I don't want someone else's child being put in danger, because that's her whole thing, is she wants to protect her children, but not at the expense of other children. So that's why she volunteers to do it, rather than just, yeah, I'll do it, why not?
But there were no children rats in the source material, so
Of course.
can't be adding those.
Again, I'm not saying Don Bluth or anyone involved in this had a crush on Mrs. Brisby, but aside from the fact they have every character hit on her, they now have her get naked.
Yeah, it's weird. There's a scene earlier where she wakes up, she gets out of bed, and she's not wearing her, like, shawl or cape. And again, I was just like, oh, is that a naked mouse? And it feels weird.
Yeah, it does. She does succeed in drugging the cat, though, but doesn't quite manage to make it back and is caught by one of the farmer's children and put in a cage to keep, which I'm quite glad they don't just immediately kill her, which is what I thought they were going to. I like the kids aren't complete monsters. And the rats respond with, oh well, and then they just fuck off.
I think Justin says something like, oh, we'll have to come back and get her later. It's like, you're just about to move her house with her children in. Surely she should be there for that. Like, get her out first.
He says it as convincingly as when you tell, like, someone collecting for a charity, like, oh, no, yeah, I'll look into it. If you email me the details, I'll look into it.
I do enjoy the escape sequence. So Mrs. Brisby is now a naked mouse in a bird cage, of all things. And she overhears a conversation that the farmer has with Nim on the phone, and Nim are coming to tear up the rose bush where the rats live. So suddenly there's now an element of, oh, okay, well, the rats, their plan of they have to move has to go ahead, because in fact I think the villain's plot is that he doesn't want them to move. He's like, no, we're doing perfectly fine as scavengers, we'll just stay here. And so obviously he wants that to happen, in a way that can happen is if he kills Nicodemus. And yeah, the finale is just this kind of weird convoluted thing where he's like, well, when we're moving the cinder block, I'm going to drop the cinder block on Nicodemus, killing him, and then everyone will have to listen to me.
Just backpedaling one moment, how did the call with the National Institute of Mental Health and the farmer go? Was it, heads up, we were experimenting on some mice, we gave them human-level intellect, we tracked them to live in your farm, can we destroy your garden? The farmer just went, yes.
It's weird, he says like, I've not noticed that they're more intelligent, but they have been avoiding the traps, but I do want to get rid of them, so come in and help yourselves. But it's just like, why do you not have more questions? You've had several calls now from the National Institute of Mental Health, really interested in the rats in your garden.
If I was Nim, I'd just be like, yeah, we're from the local council, you can't have those rats, we need to get rid of them.
Are your rats wearing clothes?
Imagine if the FBI called up and went, we need to talk to you about your wallpaper. You'd be like, why? Especially since I live in Britain.
And so we're in the finale of this film, which I think is animated beautifully. I think the sequence of lifting the cinder block with the pulleys and the cranes is really well done, and you've got the great animation on the rain, and it's very, scary and intimidating when unnamed evil mouse rat is like, oh, it's time to drop the cinder block on Nicodemus. I mean, I don't know what Nicodemus was doing standing under the cinder block, but, okay.
Again, maybe there's an unseen scene where the evil rat just says, I think you'd be best placed to just stand right in the middle of this to oversee operations. And Nicodemus goes, good idea, I'll do that. Rather than, I'm an old rat, I'm very important, maybe I should just stay out of the rain.
Like, was no one else harmed? It just seemed to be Nicodemus that got killed, so...
And I'll say this, he gets absolutely flattened. There's no Disney moment of like, oh, I've been crushed, but I can have like a few sentences and say goodbye. He's just dead.
I do enjoy the idea of the farmer going out to his field the next day and just seeing a crushed rat with like robes on.
For the same reasons Mrs. Brisby has to strip naked when she runs across the floor because they can't be caught in clothes. They have to strip Nicodemus to be like, no, just a dead rat.
He is holding his magic pen still, though. We did forget about that.
Ah, damn it. And then, because we need an action sequence at the end, as Mrs. Brisby's house is sinking into the mud, Justin, the captain of the guard, in case you've forgotten, and there's this sort of secondary protagonist, maybe, has a sword fight with the evil rat, which, again, it's somewhat meaningless because it doesn't really make much sense, but there's some great voice performances here, and it's animated superbly. Like, it's like a live-action sword fight. It's great.
It's really good. The animators clearly knew what they were doing, and they knew how to create dramatic tension, at least visually. But yeah, it's just kind of meaningless. I don't really care about the character of Justin. He was introduced far too late. Again, I feel you can start merging characters. So Mr. Aegis could have been Justin. You could have had the friend of her husband, who was a rat, let's say, or a mouse. He could still be a mouse, it doesn't really matter. But when it's revealed that Mr. Aegis knows the rats of Nim, if you make that the same character, it's like, right, I know the rats of Nim, I'm one of them, and I'm captain of the guard. And then suddenly this fight sequence at the end maybe has a bit more stakes.
Yeah, it just feels like you're the good guy, I'm the bad guy, let's have a fight. It's like the Darth Maul lightsaber fight at the end of Phantom Menace, where the characters just square up and go, guess we're going to have a fight then. I guess he's got a bit of a motivation because Nicodemus has been killed, but we've established that is pretty arbitrary and what are the reasons why. Again, there's lots of interesting motivations. Like, if they'd put more focus on the intelligence side of things, you could have the villain be like, I want to go back to Nim, because, they made us intelligent, maybe they'll do more for us. Because you can kind of believe why someone might think that, even though it's at the cost of your freedom and going under these horrible experiments. But no, he just doesn't want to move.
I like stealing electricity.
Yeah, it's not a great motivation, is it? Free electricity.
I mean, Jafar could have done with that motivation instead of making Iago generate all the electricity.
To be fair, though, Jafar lives in a world that doesn't have electricity.
I was about to say, and that's it, but it's not, because the rat gets defeated, but the house is sinking into the mud, and all the children start drowning in mud, and it's like, oh no, what's happening? And it just goes under. But luckily, as you mentioned earlier, there was a Deus Ex provided earlier in the film in the form of the amulet, and the amulet just kind of glows and levitates the house to safety.
I've just written Mouse Jesus.
And again, this was an element added by Don Bluth himself. There's no magic in the original source material. He was like, I want to have these magical elements. So I think it's a very pretty sequence, but I feel nothing when I'm watching it, because it's just like, oh, we need to save the house quickly. What's a way we can do that? Again, it would have been more effective, and what I imagine happens in the book is that the rats all grab the ropes and pull it out.
There's just not really any suitable theming here or character arc for Mrs. Brisby, because when she's given the amulet, she's told, oh, only sort of courage can activate this. But I think she's proven courage at this point already. She's visited all these terrifying new places and gone massively outside of her comfort zone. And again, you can't go the other sort of common heroic arc of learning self-sacrifice, because she probably would sacrifice herself to save her children. So it's really difficult to kind of set that up. Yeah, I think there's maybe something more interesting around maybe unity is a kind of theme here of we're weaker divided than we are together. So, maybe Mrs. Brisby sort of brings together these two factions of rats that have pulled apart and says, none of this matters if we're letting children die or something. But no, it's just magic. Well, as I say, it's Mouse Jesus.
She has the same problem that I sort of have with Belle, in that she's a perfect character at the start of the film and she's a perfect character at the end of the film, and there's not really any growth to achieve. I think when the protagonist of your film doesn't have a character arc, that is a problem.
Yeah, it is a problem. It's a pretty big problem in this film specifically.
And that is The Secret of Nim. We get one last sequence of Jeremy building a nest to attract someone, and okay, thanks Jeremy, glad to know you're still here.
It works. He gets a lady crow. I've got a note and I said, does this film end on a child mouse watching two crows bang? Because that's almost where it looks like it's going.
The end credits are very pretty, I'll give the film that.
You said that so reluctantly. But yeah, we see, as you say, we see Mrs. Brisby and her children, they're safe. For now, I guess, because this seems to be a recurring problem. And again, like, maybe I'd almost like if they learnt into that a bit more, because it's a bit everyone lived happily ever after, but I feel that it would suit the tone of this film more if it was like, well, we've overcome this problem, but, our lives are a struggle because it's hard being a mouse in a field. But it just sort of ends on a bit of a schmaltzy note. At least there's not a dance party.
Not yet. Would a dance party have improved this film?
No, Liam, it improves nothing. It doesn't improve parties or dances.
You'd get to see Nicodemus dancing.
No, he's dead.
Well, you could cut to just his hand from under the crushed cinder block, just kind of like waving about to the music.
Do like a Michael Jackson Rise from the Grave do Thriller or something. And yeah, as we say, that's kind of how The Secret of Nim ends. But before we pass final judgment, Liam, we may have moved past Disney characters, but I feel there's still something we've not discussed. Is there anything else we need to touch on regarding The Secret of Nim?
There is just one thing. We need to decide which character in The Secret of Nim we feel is the sexiest. As always, we're talking about characters that we believe are unnecessarily or inappropriately sexualized for a family entertainment film. And I'm going to be quite frank, one thing we can look forward to for pretty much all of the Don Bluth films is that they are particularly unsexy and really unsexualized. And I'll be frank, I know we've joked about Don Bluth drawing sexy characters before, but I really feel that this is a very unsexy and unsexualized film overall, and I'm really struggling to decide on any character that's particularly sexy. So Ben, who have you decided is the sexiest character in The Secret of Nim?
Are we overlooking the fact that they constantly sexualise Mrs. Brisby? Because I feel like every character is like, she's a babe. Now, I'm not saying I, as an audience member, am made to feel that way, but clearly every character in this film does that. And I think even if in terms of artistic style she's not sexualized, she's certainly sexualized in terms of the way the characters react to her. So I think Mrs. Brisby is a clear pick here.
That's a very good point. The only way I can sort of describe it is it's like if you took how everyone reacts to Esmeralda but was for Quasimodo. So yeah, I guess it is Mrs. Brisby. And again, it's not through any decision of the animation behind her or her character, but it's just how everyone treats her. I suppose that's a very good point. So our first non-Disney addition to the list of sexiest characters is a poor widowed mouse who everyone just keeps hitting on, including a bird.
One of my notes about halfway through this film is take the effing hint, Jeremy. It's not going to happen. She basically says as much. I'm not interested. Go away.
And so before we can decide whether or not we believe The Secret of Nim has done enough to earn a spot on the list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics, first we must retrieve the list itself. With the rats of Nim departed for Thorn Valley and the rosebush torn up, I pop down into Nicodemus's lair, look at his tiny little magic mirror to see where we left the list last, and it's revealed that it's hidden under a concrete block out in the field. So I pick it up, grab the list, and with my magical delayed writing pen in hand, Ben, am I writing The Secret of Nim on the list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics?
When a film's new for me, I can find it hard to make the call as to whether it does enough to make it onto our list. I found it difficult because some stuff's a novelty, and all the slow burn stuff that you need time to think about, you don't really get a chance to react to. But to be honest, even on my first watch of this film, I realised it was going to be a no. I think the visual style is really appealing, and I think there's some really strong elements here. And I think this is a recurring theme we see with not just with Don Bluth, but with some other prominent figures in animation as well. They are animators first and foremost, and writers and directors second, and the story just doesn't quite click here. And I know this is a script that went through a lot of work, as we've touched on. It was adapted and changed a lot from the source material. All the interesting elements don't get enough time, and a lot of the faffy, uninteresting elements do get a lot of time. The scenes that just don't go anywhere, and they just feel like filler. The one thing I would say, and I said this at the start, but I think Mrs. Brisby as a character is superb. There's such a quality to that animation, performance and design that just really brings me into the film in spite of all the stuff that I don't think works. I didn't really know the voice performer Elizabeth Hartman prior to this film, so I looked her up, and there's a real sort of sad note to that in that this was her last film performance. She was only in her early 40s. She very sadly took her own life after this film, and I think she adds a real sadness to this film. And it's weird because I felt like I picked up on that prior to knowing that, but there's a real sort of sadness and gravity to this film, and I think it's absolutely the right call in terms of that performance. So even though I love that character, that performance, and I love this world and this art style, at the end of the day it needs to be an engaging, cohesive, coherent story, and it doesn't do that. I was bored and annoyed more often than I was engaged and having an emotional reaction, so for me it's a no.
Bored and annoyed is probably the best way of describing my feelings towards this film. I remember loving it as a child, but I honestly can't see what a child would get out of this film. I like that the studio wanted to tell a story with some more mature themes, and as you say, the idea of centering the film on this mother works really well, and the animation is beautiful. Having seen all of the Disney films from this era, this is one of the most beautifully animated films of that decade of the 80s, at least from the West, definitely. And it's clear this was made by people with an incredible passion for animation, but as you say, they just don't have that skill and passion for screenwriting. And yes, a lot of the problems are problems in the source material, but a good screenwriter knows what to adapt and what to change. I like that Don Bluth fought for having the focus of the story be more on Mrs. Brisby, but in making that change, so much else of the story has to be changed as well, and they just adapted kind of directly in those elements, and they don't work. You needed to merge characters, cut sequences, make your characters and your arc fit a good narrative structure for a film. They didn't do that, and the end result is, as you say, just boring and annoying. So it's a no from me as well. Which is a shame. I was really hoping to put the first Don Bluth film on this list. I've got a great amount of love for that man. I love his work at Disney, and I thought I loved a lot of his work outside of Disney, but I'm now beginning to think that maybe there's a bit of rose-tinted nostalgia when I look back at those films.
It makes me really worried because I think his next few films are considered to be probably his best, but also I know that this is considered to be one of his best. So I'm really not feeling optimistic about the ones that are considered to be bad of his. But we shall see.
And with that, the list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics returns to the vault, still only containing Walt Disney animated classics. But of course, we are hoping to change that very soon by looking across all different animation studios to see which ones are animated classics. So Ben, which film are we going to be taking a look at next time?
Next week, Liam, we are looking at our first non-Western based film. We are going to 1984's Norsica of the Valley of the Wind, often considered the unofficial first Studio Ghibli film, and certainly the first anime we're going to be looking at. So it's going to be a very different type of film, but one I'm sure is going to be a really interesting discussion. Of course, our views on The Secret of Nim are just that. They are our views. What are your thoughts on this film? Do you have a lot of nostalgia for it? Have you revisited it recently, or is it a completely new one for you that you're filling in for your back catalogue? As always, we're very keen to hear what your thoughts are and to have a good discussion regarding this. Waly Gisnep is available on SoundCloud, Spotify, a selection of other podcast hosting platforms, as well as YouTube, where we post memes, interviews, edits, and video versions of both our main podcast, Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics, and Waly Gisnep's Top 10s, where we look at Disney films through different lenses and create our own personal top 10s of various different kinds.
With that, all that's left to say is thank you for listening. We genuinely do appreciate it, and hope that you are looking forward to, as much as we are, to looking at different animated films across different animated studios. So remember to join us next time for Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics.